Welcome, dear traveler, and welcome back to Mythborn, where ancient legends come alive, one story at a time. Before we begin, find a comfortable place to settle in. Dim the lights if you'd like. Wrap yourself in a warm blanket, sink into your favorite chair, or simply get cozy in bed. Take a slow, deep breath, and let the worries of today gently drift away. For the next little while, there's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do, only a story waiting to be told. And if you enjoy relaxing journeys through the world's greatest myths and legends, take a moment to subscribe to Mythborn. Leave a like to get more sleep stories like this, and ring the bell so you never miss another peaceful adventure. Now, close your eyes if you'd like. Let your imagination wander to the temples and shores of ancient Greece, and together let us uncover the complete story of Medusa. The complete story of Medusa, Part 1. There is an island at the edge of the old maps, not the edge of the world. The Greeks knew the world curved on, past every horizon they'd charted. This was the edge of something else, the edge of what people were willing to speak of. After dark, sailors marked it with a blank space on the chart and a warning beside the blank space. Then they rowed the other way. If you had gone there anyway, in the gray hour before sunrise, you would have found a shoreline the color of ash. No birds, no insects, just wind and stone and the sound of the sea talking to itself, the way it does when it thinks no one is listening. And somewhere past the rocks, in the mouth of a shallow cave, someone was waiting. Not to hunt you, just waiting. The way you wait for a life that already happened, to finally leave you alone. Tonight, we're going to find out how she got there. Settle in. There's no test at the end of this. No need to hold on to a single name or a single date. Just let the story unfold the way it was meant to, slowly and from the very beginning. Because almost everything you've heard about this woman is only the ending, told by people who never once asked how it started. This is the story of Medusa. Chapter 1. Where the Gorgons Come From. Long before Zeus ever held a thunderbolt, the world ran on older rules. In the beginning, there was only chaos. Not chaos in the sense of noise and disorder. Chaos, as the Greeks meant it, a yawning, formless gap, the space before there was even a somewhere for anything to be. Out of that gap came Gaia, the earth itself, solid ground appearing out of nothing the way an idea appears out of silence. And from Gaia came Eranos, the sky, stretched out above her like a roof over a house that hadn't been built yet. Together, earth and sky made the first great family of gods. The Titans, towering, ancient, older than morality itself. Most of what came after, Zeus, Poseidon, Athena, the whole glittering Olympian court, would eventually rise up and overthrow this first generation. But before that war, before any of that, the Titans had children of their own. And it's here that our story actually begins. Among the Titans were two siblings, Oceanus and Tethys. Oceanus, the great river believed to circle the entire world. Tethys, the goddess of the fresh waters that fed it. From their union came an enormous family of sea gods and river spirits, more than 3,000 of them, if the old poets are to be believed. And two of their children, a brother and sister named Phorcys and Ceto, became something specific. The gods of the ocean's hidden dangers. Not the ocean you'd wade into on a calm afternoon. The other ocean. The one below the light. Phorcys and Ceto ruled over everything a sailor feared but couldn't name. The reef you don't see until it's too late. The current that pulls you somewhere no one will ever find you. The shape in the water that might be nothing, might be everything. It makes a strange kind of sense, then, that when Phorcys and Ceto had children of their own, those children were built entirely out of dread. There were the Grey, three sisters born already old, gray-haired from the moment of their birth, sharing a single eye and a single tooth between them, passing both back and forth like the world's strangest inheritance. There was Ladon, the serpent who would one day coil around a tree of golden apples at the far western edge of the earth. There was Echidna, half woman, half serpent, who mortals would later call the mother of all monsters, because nearly every terrible creature in Greek myth, the Hydra, the Chimera, the Nemean lion, would eventually trace its bloodline back to her. And there were the Gorgons, three daughters born together: Stheno, whose name means the forceful one, Uriel, the far-springing, and the youngest of the three, Medusa. Her name is where the story gets interesting, before it's even begun. Medusa comes from an old Greek root meaning to rule, or to protect, or to be cunning. The same root that gives us words like Madon, meaning lord or guardian. It is not a monster's name, it is a queen's name. Whoever first told this story chose a word that meant power, and then spent 3,000 years deciding what to do with a woman who had it. Here is the detail almost no one repeats, and it's the one that makes everything that follows so much sadder. Stheno and Uriel were immortal. Medusa was not. She was the only mortal in a family of monsters, the only one who could die. The only one, in other words, who had anything left to lose. Chapter 2. The House of Dread. It's worth lingering here a moment longer before the story moves on, because the family Medusa was born into tells you almost everything about the world she was about to be dropped into. Perseus and Chato did not live among the Olympians. They were not invited to feasts on a mountaintop. They ruled from somewhere far older and far darker, a domain that predates the neat, orderly cosmos Zeus would eventually impose on everything. Think of it this way. Every generation of gods, in the Greek imagination, was an attempt to bring order to something that came before it. Chaos gave way to Gaia and Ouranos. The Titans gave way eventually to the Olympians. Each new order pushed the older, wilder forces further to the margins, into caves, into the deep sea, into the edges of maps. Perseus and Ceto were pushed to those margins, and so were their children. Which means the Gorgons were never really monsters in the way later stories would flatten them into. They were something closer to leftovers of an older world, fragments of the raw, unfiltered dread that existed before anyone tried to civilize the universe. That distinction matters because it changes what Medusa's curse actually did to her. She wasn't turned into a monster. She was pushed backward, out of the world of temples and cities and civilized order that Athena represented, and into the older, wilder world her own family had never quite left. In a very real sense, her punishment sent her home. Except it wasn't her home. Not really. She had never lived among reefs and hidden currents the way her parents and grandparents had. She had lived by choice inside a marble temple, tending the sacred flame, devoted to a goddess of wisdom and order. The curse didn't just disfigure her. It undid a choice she had made about who she wanted to be. The rest of the monstrous family. Before we leave this strange, dread-built household entirely, it's worth naming a few more of its members. Not as a detour, but because they show up again and again, threaded through nearly every other Greek myth you already know. And because understanding them tells you something about how thin the line was in the Greek imagination between monster and family. Echidna, half woman and half serpent, is usually described as living in a cave far from gods and mortals alike, much like Medusa would one day be forced to. With her mate, the fire-breathing giant Typhon, a creature so enormous and so violent that even Zeus reportedly fled from him at first. Echidna produced an entire generation of Greece's most famous monsters. The Hydra, the many-headed serpent that would one day face Heracles at the swamps of Lerna, regrowing 2 heads for every one severed. The Chimera, a creature stitched together from lion, goat, and serpent, breathing fire from a goat's head, sprouting absurdly from its own spine. Cerberus, the 3-headed hound who would guard the gates of the underworld for the rest of eternity, allowing souls to enter and never permitting them to leave. Even the Sphinx, who would one day pose her riddle to travelers on the road to Thebes, and Orthus, the 2-headed hound who guarded the cattle of Geryon far to the west. Both of them, too, traced back to this same primordial family line. Notice what's happening here. Nearly every monster a Greek hero ever fought, Heracles' labors, Bellerophon's battles, Oedipus's riddle, ultimately shares a grandmother with Medusa. They are cousins, in the loosest mythological sense. Different faces of the same old family of dread, each one eventually cut down by a mortal hero looking to make a name for himself. It's a pattern worth remembering as we go forward, because Medusa's death was never really unique in the eyes of the wider myth cycle. She was one entry in a very long list of monstrous children, each of them eventually hunted down by an ambitious young man with something to prove. What made her different, what still makes her different 3,000 years later, is that she alone, among all of them, hadn't started out as a monster at all. Chapter 3. The Priestess. Before the snakes. Before the name became a warning whispered to children, Medusa was, by every ancient account, breathtaking. Not in the vague way beauty gets described in old stories, but specifically, almost obsessively so. Later poets would write that men crossed entire regions of Greece just to catch a glimpse of her, that kings sent envoys asking for her hand, that her hair, her actual hair, dark and heavy and gleaming, was the single most admired feature of any woman in the ancient world, and she wanted none of it. Medusa chose instead to devote her life to Athena, goddess of wisdom, of weaving, of strategy and craft, and the kind of clear-eyed intelligence the Greeks prized above almost anything else. To serve in Athena's temple was one of the highest honors available to a young woman in the ancient world, and it came with a single absolute condition: chastity. A priestess of Athena set aside marriage, courtship, all of it, in exchange for a life spent in the goddess's own sacred service. Medusa took that vow willingly. By most tellings, happily. She wasn't a woman waiting to be chosen by someone else. She had already chosen a temple, a goddess, a purpose. And for a while, that was enough. Picture it if you like. A young priestess moving through a marble temple at dawn, tending the sacred flame. Her footsteps the only sound in the whole quiet building. A life of devotion, ritual, and calm. It's the kind of ordinary morning that has no idea it's about to become the hinge on which an entire myth turns. Because on one particular day, the god of the sea walked in. The goddess Medusa served. It helps, before we go any further, to understand exactly who Athena was, because everything that happens next depends on it. Athena was not born the way other gods were born. The old stories say that Zeus, warned by a prophecy that a child of his first wife, Medusa, would one day grow powerful enough to overthrow him, chose to swallow Metis whole rather than risk it. But Metis was already pregnant, and the child inside her did not simply vanish. Some time later, Zeus was struck by a blinding headache so severe that he begged another god, usually said to be Hephaestus, to split his skull open with an axe. And from that wound, fully grown and already armored, sprang Athena, goddess of wisdom, strategy, weaving, and civilized order, born without a mother in any conventional sense, carrying nothing of the messy, physical world of birth and blood that other gods and mortals were bound to. This detail matters more than it might seem to at first. Athena was, among all the Olympians, the one most closely associated with rational order over raw instinct, with civilization over the wilder, older forces her own father had helped subdue. She was also, notably, a virgin goddess, one of only 3 among the Olympians who never married or bore children. Her power instead tied up entirely in her independence, her intellect, and her self-sufficiency. It's why a temple to Athena, more than almost any other god's temple in Greece, represented an especially specific kind of sanctuary. Not simply a holy place, but a place governed by exactly the values Athena herself embodied: reason, discipline, self-possession, the deliberate setting aside of the body's ordinary claims in favor of the mind's higher ones. For Medusa, choosing to serve there wasn't simply picking a convenient goddess to devote herself to. It was choosing the one deity in the entire Greek pantheon whose whole identity was built around control, order, and untouchability. She was choosing, in other words, exactly the kind of protection that should have made what happened next impossible. That's what makes Poseidon's intrusion into that specific temple so pointed, and Athena's response so devastating. It wasn't simply an assault. It was a violation of the one place in the ancient world built entirely around the principle that this could not happen. And the goddess who should have embodied that principle most fiercely chose, instead, to protect her own position rather than her devoted priestess. A god with a pattern. It's worth knowing, too, exactly what kind of god walked into that temple, because Poseidon's treatment of Medusa was not, in the wider context of Greek myth, an isolated act. Poseidon appears across dozens of surviving stories as a god with a long and troubling record of pursuing mortal and semi-divine women, almost always without consent, and almost always leaving the woman to deal with the consequences alone. There was Amymone, a princess sent to fetch water during a drought, pursued by Poseidon, after he intervened to save her from a satyr, a rescue that folded immediately into another kind of danger entirely. There was Aethra, whose encounter with the god became tangled into the parentage of the hero Theseus. There was Canis, born Canis, whose story the old poets tell with particular strangeness, violated by Poseidon, and then granted, at her own request, transformation into an invulnerable male warrior, as though becoming unreachable were the only kind of justice the myths could imagine offering her. Across all of these stories, a pattern holds steady. Poseidon acts. The mortal woman absorbs whatever consequence follows: exile, transformation, a difficult pregnancy, a life reshaped entirely around a single encounter she never chose. The god, meanwhile, simply continues being a god, unbothered, moving on to govern his oceans and his earthquakes and his endless rivalry with his fellow Olympians. This context doesn't make what happened to Medusa any less specific or any less devastating, but it does something else worth noting. It tells you that Athena's choice to punish Medusa rather than Poseidon wasn't some strange one-time failure of judgment from an otherwise fair goddess. It was Athena declining to be the one exception in a divine order that had never once held Poseidon accountable for anything. Every other god who might have intervened on Medusa's behalf had exactly the same incentive Athena did. A powerful, temperamental Olympian, difficult to oppose, better left unchallenged. And so, exactly like every other time, the consequences rolled downhill and landed on the one person in the story who held no power to stop any of it. Chapter 4. What was taken and what was blamed. Here the old poets, Ovid especially, writing centuries later in Rome, tell a story that has survived, almost unchanged, for 2,000 years. It's not a comfortable one, and we're not going to linger on the details, because the details were never really the point. What matters is what happened, and far more importantly, what happened afterward. Poseidon, god of the sea, wanted her. And Poseidon was not a god accustomed to being told no. Inside the walls of Athena's own temple, the one place that should have been the safest ground in the ancient world for a woman under that goddess's protection, Poseidon forced himself on Medusa. The ancient sources don't dwell on it. We won't either. What they do dwell on at length is what came next, because what came next is the actual tragedy at the center of this myth. Athena found out, and Athena was furious. Here's where you'd expect the story to turn toward justice. A goddess of wisdom discovering that her own sacred temple had been desecrated, that one of her devoted priestesses had been violated in the one place meant to protect her. Surely her anger would fall on Poseidon. It didn't. Poseidon was too powerful to punish. He was Athena's uncle, an Olympian in his own right, a god whose favor and whose rivalry the other gods had to carefully manage. To move against him directly meant war among immortals, and even goddesses have to pick their battles. So Athena did something that echoes through every century since, in ways that have nothing to do with mythology at all. She turned her anger on the victim instead. She looked at Medusa, grieving, violated, blameless, and instead of comfort, she gave her a curse. Medusa's famous hair, the hair men had crossed Greece to see, was transformed into a writhing crown of serpents. Her gaze, once simply beautiful, became a weapon. Anyone who looked directly into her eyes would turn instantly to stone. She was no longer welcome in the temple, no longer welcome among people at all. She was cast out to the far edges of the world, where her own sisters, immortal, loyal, and just as cursed by proximity, followed her into exile. It's worth sitting with that for a moment, because it's the actual emotional center of this whole myth, buried under 3,000 years of monster retellings. Medusa didn't do anything. She was harmed, and then she was punished for having been harmed. And then history spent the next few millennia calling her the danger. Chapter 5. The island. So she went to live at the edge of the map. Not a jungle, not a labyrinth, just a quiet, wind-scoured island where the sea never quite stopped moving and nothing grew tall enough to cast real shade. Steno and Euryale stayed with her, out of love rather than obligation, that there was little either of them could do. They were creatures who couldn't die, watching over a sister who could. This is where most tellings turn Medusa into a lurking horror, something crouched in a cave, waiting to spring. But look at what the actual myths tell us about how she spent those years, and a very different picture appears. She didn't hunt. She didn't leave the island to seek out victims the way monsters in these stories usually do. Every account agrees on this one detail. Men came looking for her. Young adventurers hunting glory, or a king's favor, or simply a story to tell. They sailed out to the edge of the world specifically to test themselves against the Gorgon, because killing a monster was one of the fastest ways to become a legend. Medusa never went looking for a fight. She simply existed, and men kept arriving with swords. And her only defense, the one the goddess had built into her without asking, turned out to be permanent and absolute. She wasn't a predator. She was cursed into becoming the world's most effective form of leave me alone, and the world simply refused to take the hint. Imagine those years, if you can. The tide coming in and going out with no one to mark the time by. The particular silence of an island nobody sails to on purpose. Her sisters nearby, but no laughter. No conversation that didn't circle back eventually to what had been lost. Just wind, salt air, and the quiet permanent knowledge that the life she'd chosen, temple, service, purpose, had been taken from her twice. Once by Poseidon, and once by the goddess she trusted to protect her. It would have been easy telling this story, to leave her there, a woman alone on a gray shore, forgotten by everyone except the men who came to kill her. But her story wasn't finished, because far away on the mainland, a boy was growing up under the shadow of a prophecy, one that would eventually send him sailing to that exact island, carrying gifts from the very gods who had made Medusa what she was. That's where we'll pick up next. The story of a hero, a king's cruel challenge, and the dear young man named Perseus set out to do the impossible. The sisters who stayed. There's one more piece of the island years worth sitting with before we leave them behind, and it's the part the old poets frustratingly tell us the least about, which is exactly why it deserves a little more attention here. Steno and Uriel had no reason to follow Medusa into exile. They weren't cursed. They weren't blamed. Whatever Athena's fury had been aimed at, it hadn't touched either of them directly. They could have stayed wherever Gorgons were tolerated, could have lived out their long, immortal lives without ever setting foot on that gray, wind-scoured shore. They went anyway. That choice, quiet, almost entirely undocumented, easy to skip past in a story built around Perseus's heroics, might be one of the most genuinely selfless acts in this entire myth cycle. Two immortal sisters giving up whatever life they might otherwise have had to sit with a sister who could die on an island where nothing grew and no one visited except men carrying swords. Ancient art gives us a little more than the poets do here. Base paintings and temple friezes often show all three Gorgon sisters together, running or in flight, wings spread, presented as a unit rather than as one cursed figure flanked by two bystanders. Some scholars who study this imagery have suggested that in the popular imagination, at least, the three sisters were rarely separated the way the literary tradition eventually separated them. That ordinary Greeks, looking at these images on the sides of a drinking cup or the corner of a temple wall, understood the Gorgons first and foremost as a family bound together rather than as one mortal target surrounded by two immortal spectators. It's worth imagining, too, what those years actually might have looked like, day to day, stripped of the language of curses and monsters entirely. Three sisters on a shoreline, two of them unable to die, one of them increasingly aware that she someday would. A kind of grief that had no ending to wait for, because the person being grieved was still right there, still breathing, still watching the same tide come in and go out. There's no surviving myth that tells us what Steno and Uriel said to each other in the aftermath, once Perseus had come and gone, and the deed was finally, irreversibly done. But the old poets do agree on one thing. Their morning cry, when they woke to find their sister gone, was described as louder than any storm the island had ever weathered. Grief loud enough to carry for miles across open water. That's not the sound two indifferent immortals make over someone they merely tolerated. That's the sound of a family losing the one member of it who was never supposed to be able to leave them. Part 2. The Boy in the Bronze Tower. Welcome back. If you're just settling in now, know only this. On a windswept island at the edge of the known world, a woman named Medusa lives in exile, cursed by a goddess for a crime that was never hers, guarded by two immortal sisters who cannot save her from what's coming. We left her watching the tide. Now we turn away from the island, back toward the mainland, toward a story that begins, as so many of these old stories do, with a king who was afraid of a dream. Chapter 6. A Prophecy in a Bronze Room. There was once a king of Argos named Acrisius, and Acrisius had exactly one problem in his life, which was that he had no sons. He had a daughter, Danae, said to be lovely in the particular quiet way that made poets nervous, because that kind of beauty in these stories almost never ends well for the woman who owns it. But a daughter, in the eyes of a king obsessed with his own bloodline, was not the same as an heir. So Acrisius did what worried kings in these stories always do. He went to an oracle and asked what his future held. He should not have asked. The oracle told him, in the flat, unbothered tone oracles always seemed to use for the worst news imaginable, that Acrisius would have no son of his own, but that his daughter would, and that her son, this grandson, not yet born, not yet even conceived, would one day be the instrument of the old king's death. Acrisius did not take this news well. You would think, hearing a prophecy like that, a man might simply try to be a good grandfather and hope for the best. Acrisius instead did the thing frightened, powerful men so often do when handed inconvenient news about the future. He decided the future was something he could outplan. He had a chamber built, not a tower exactly, not in the fairy tale sense, more like a sealed room, half sunk into the earth, walled in bronze, roofed over, so that no man could climb in and no man could climb out. And into this chamber he placed his own daughter, Danae, with guards posted at the only door. There she was to remain, unmarried, untouched, childless, for the rest of her days. A prophecy solved, the king told himself. The way men tell themselves things they badly want to be true. He had accounted for every man in Argos. He had not accounted for the sky. Zeus, king of the gods, was many things: reckless, unfaithful, prone to appearing in mortal lives in ways that caused decades of consequences for everyone except him. But he was rarely deterred by something as mundane as a locked bronze room. The old poets say he came to Danae not as a man, not even as a god in any recognizable form, but as a shower of gold, pouring down through whatever gap existed between the roof beams and the sky, filling the small sealed chamber with a soft, warm light that no god outside ever noticed. And from that quiet, strange visitation, Danae conceived a son. She named him Perseus. Chapter 7. The Chest on the Water. For a while, Acrisius didn't know. That's worth sitting with. The ordinary, almost domestic stretch of time in which a mother nursed her infant son in the sealed room in secret, while somewhere above them a king believed his prophecy had been successfully outmaneuvered. Danae must have known every single day that the secret had a shape and a sound, and could not stay hidden forever. Babies cry. Rooms have walls, but walls have guards. And gods talk. Eventually, the stories don't agree on exactly how. Whether Acrisius heard the child's voice echoing up through the stone, or whether a servant's whispered gossip finally reached him. The king discovered that his daughter had a son after all. His fear didn't diminish with time. If anything, it had grown sharper, more specific. Now that the abstract threat of a grandson had become an actual infant with an actual name, Acrisius could not bring himself to kill the boy outright. Even a king terrified of prophecy balked at the particular horror of murdering his own grandson and daughter with his own hands, a crime the gods punished with a special, permanent kind of fury. So he chose something that let him tell himself it wasn't murder. He had Danae and the infant Perseus sealed inside a large wooden chest, and had the chest set adrift on the open sea. Picture it, if the picture will hold. A mother in the dark, salt water slapping against wooden planks inches from her face, an infant asleep against her chest with no understanding at all of how close this ordinary feeling boat ride was to becoming the end of everything. Danae had no oars, no sail, no say in where the current would take them. Just the small, terrible faith that the sea might be kinder than her own father had been. The sea was kinder. The chest drifted for days, carried by current and wind, until it washed up on the shore of a small island called Seriphos. And there a fisherman named Dictys, a humble, decent man, the kind who rarely gets remembered by name in stories built around kings and monsters, but who deserves to be, found the chest half buried in the sand, pulled it open, and found a woman and her son. alive, exhausted, and utterly without a home, Dictys took them in. He raised Perseus not as a prophecy or a threat, but simply as a boy, teaching him to fish, to swim, to read the weather off the color of the horizon. And on the quiet island of Seriphos, far from the bronze room and the terrified king who built it, Perseus grew up. Another woman, another cage. It's worth noticing, before we move any further into Perseus's story, how closely his mother's early years echo the very tragedy his quest would eventually end. Danae, like Medusa, did nothing to invite what happened to her. She was not consulted about the prophecy that reshaped her entire life before she'd even had the chance to have a son. She was not asked whether she wanted to spend her formative years sealed in a bronze room, watched over by gods, denied marriage, denied courtship, denied nearly every ordinary freedom a young woman in the ancient world might have hoped for. Her own father made that decision for her out of fear for himself, dressed up as protection of the family line. And when Zeus came to her, however the old poets choose to soften that visitation with imagery of golden light rather than blunt language, the consequence of that encounter fell, as it so often did in these stories, entirely on her, not on the god. On the woman locked in the room he'd entered uninvited, cast adrift on the open sea in a sealed chest, with an infant she had to somehow keep alive through days of open water, salt spray, and total uncertainty about whether the current would carry them to land or simply out into open ocean forever. Danae's ordeal is, in miniature, the same shape as Medusa's exile. A woman punished, or at minimum endangered, for something entirely outside her control, cast out by the very family that should have protected her. The difference, and it's a meaningful one, is that Danae's story ends in rescue. A humble fisherman finds the chest. A home is offered. A boy grows up loved rather than feared. It's tempting, telling Medusa's story, to wonder what a version of her myth might have looked like with a Dictys of her own, some ordinary, decent stranger who found her on that gray shore not to test himself against a monster, but simply to offer shelter to a woman who'd been wronged. No such figure ever arrives for her. Every visitor to that island came with a sword rather than an open hand, until the one man who finally did approach her came to end her life rather than change it. Two women, two prophecies neither of them asked for, two forms of exile imposed by men with more power than either of them held. One found a fisherman. The other never did. Chapter 8. The King Who Wanted a Horse. There is, unfortunately, always another king. Dictys the fisherman had a brother, and that brother, Polydectes, happened to rule Seriphos as its king. Where Dictys was gentle and unremarkable in the best sense of the word, Polydectes was neither. He noticed Danae the way Poseidon had once noticed Medusa, not as a person with a life of her own, but as something he wanted and intended eventually to have. For years, this wasn't much of a problem, mostly because Perseus was growing into a young man capable of standing between his mother and anyone who might threaten her. And Polydectes, whatever his faults, wasn't foolish enough to move directly against a king's grown grandson under his own roof. So he decided instead to get Perseus out of the way, not through force but through cleverness. The kind of scheme a man convinces himself is elegant, right up until it goes catastrophically wrong. Polydectes announced that he intended to marry a woman named Hippodamia, and as was customary, he asked every young nobleman in his court to bring a wedding gift. Horses, specifically. Fine, well-bred horses being the traditional offering for an occasion like this, and precisely the kind of gift a king could use to quietly measure the wealth and the loyalty of the men around him. Perseus, who owned no horse and had no fortune to buy one, found himself cornered in front of the entire court. And here is where a young man's pride, understandable pride, The pride of someone who has spent his whole life being underestimated became the hinge on which the rest of the story turns. Rather than admit he had nothing to give, Perseus declared in front of everyone that he would bring Polydectes anything he wanted. Anything at all, name it. It's the kind of thing said in the heat of an embarrassing moment. The kind of promise that feels bold for exactly as long as it takes the room to go quiet. And Polydectes, who had been waiting for precisely this opening, smiled and asked for the one gift he was certain no living man could deliver. He asked for the head of Medusa the Gorgon. The room, by every account, understood immediately what had just happened. This wasn't a wedding gift. It was a death sentence, dressed up as one. Chapter 9. A goddess chooses a side. Perseus had made a promise in front of witnesses, and a promise made in front of the king's entire court was not the kind of thing a young man of honor could simply walk back. He would have to go. He had no idea, setting out from Seriphos with nothing but resolve and a badly formed plan, where the island even was. No sailor, he asked, could say for certain. Some claimed it lay past the edge of any chart. Others refused to discuss it at all. It's here that the story takes its strangest turn. And, depending on how you feel about the goddess by this point, its most uncomfortable one. Because the deity who chose to step in and help Perseus succeed was the very same goddess who had cursed Medusa in the first place. Athena. The old poets never quite explain this the way a modern audience might want them to. There's no scene of Athena wrestling with guilt. No moment of the goddess reckoning with what she'd done to an innocent woman years before. What we're given instead is simpler and colder. Athena had created something dangerous, and now she wanted it removed. The same clean, distant logic a person might apply to disposing of a weapon they regretted building, rather than the person that weapon had once been. Whatever her reasons, Athena appeared to Perseus and told him plainly that this quest was not something a mortal boy could accomplish through courage alone. He would need help, divine help, gathered piece by piece from gods willing to lend it, and he would need, first and most urgently, information. Because even Athena did not know exactly where Medusa's island lay. Only one set of beings in the entire world held that secret. 3 ancient sisters called the Grey Ones. The same sisters, as it happens, born from the same primordial parents as Medusa herself, the Gorgon's own kin. Sharing a single eye and a single tooth between the 3 of them, passed hand to hand in an endless, careful ritual that had gone on since before Perseus's grandfather had been born. Chapter 10. The sisters who shared an eye. Following Athena's guidance, Perseus traveled to the far edge of the world, to a gray, sunless place where the gray lived in their total isolation, keeping their singular eye and their singular tooth passed constantly between them, 3 faces waiting in the dark for their turn to see. It's worth pausing here on just how strange and genuinely sad this image is, if you let yourself sit with it, rather than rush past it toward the action. 3 sisters, ancient beyond measuring, sharing one eye between them for what must have already been centuries, one always in darkness, one always waiting for her turn at sight. They had no need for violence, no interest in harming Perseus. They simply guarded a secret out of loyalty to their monstrous, tragic family, and had done so faithfully for longer than most kingdoms had existed. Perseus did not come to fight them. He came to outthink them. And what happened next has become one of the most famous tricks in all of Greek mythology. He waited in the shadows, watching the rhythm of the exchange, the eye passing from one sister's hand to the next, a brief window in between where, for just a moment, none of them could see anything at all. And in that exact instant, as the eye moved between 2 of the sisters, Perseus reached out and caught it. The 3 gray, plunged suddenly and completely into darkness, understood at once what had happened. There was no shouting in the versions of this story worth telling, just the quiet, desperate realization of three sisters who had guarded their family's secret for centuries, now utterly blind and entirely at the mercy of the stranger's voice in the dark. Perseus was not cruel about it. He told them plainly. He would return their eye, their sight, their whole shared world, the moment they told him where to find his mother's island. And the Grey, weighing their sister Medusa's fate against their own present darkness, eventually relented. They told him. He gave the eye back as he'd promised. Whatever else this story is, it's worth noting that Perseus kept his word to three old, half-forgotten sisters who had no power left to force him to. Chapter 10.5. Old before they were born. It's easy to move past the Grey quickly in this story, treating them as little more than an obstacle for Perseus to cleverly outmaneuver on his way to the real confrontation. But they deserve a moment of their own, because their condition is one of the strangest and most quietly haunting details in the entire myth cycle. Most gods and monsters in Greek myth follow something like a recognizable life. Born, growing, eventually reaching some form of maturity, occasionally aging the way mortals do, occasionally not. The Greeks skip all of that entirely. The old poets are explicit about it. They were born already old, gray-haired from their very first moment of existence, carrying the appearance of extreme age without ever having lived through the years that would normally produce it. There's no surviving myth that explains why exactly this particular family produced daughters born straight into old age, skipping childhood, skipping youth, skipping every stage of life that comes before it. But it fits in its own unsettling way with everything else we know about Phorcys and Ceto's children. This was a family built out of the ocean's oldest, most primal fears, and old age itself, arriving without warning, skipping past the vitality of youth entirely, is very much its own kind of primal dread. Consider, too, what it must have meant to share a single eye and a single tooth among three sisters for as long as they had existed. Every act of seeing had to be negotiated. Every meal presumably required the same careful passing back and forth. There was no privacy in it, no individual experience of the world separate from the other two. Every moment of sight one sister experienced came at the direct cost of the other two remaining in darkness, waiting their turn. It's a strange kind of intimacy, forced rather than chosen, and one that had apparently gone on long enough that the sisters had built an entire practiced rhythm around it. The exact rhythm Perseus needed to study and time perfectly in order to steal the eye away. That rhythm wasn't clumsiness. It was centuries of adaptation, three sisters making an impossible arrangement work for longer than most mortal civilizations managed to survive. And then a stranger arrived, understood their rhythm in a single afternoon of careful watching, and used it against them. There's no mythological account of what became of the Grey afterward. Whether they ever fully trusted a stranger's word again, whether they simply returned to their old, careful passing of the eye and the tooth, once Perseus had gone, resuming a life that had already stretched on for centuries before he ever arrived, and would presumably stretch on for centuries more after he left. It's a small, easily overlooked tragedy tucked inside a much larger one. Three ancient, half-forgotten sisters, guarding a secret out of loyalty to a family the world had already decided to fear, briefly and completely at the mercy of the very kind of young, ambitious mortal man their whole family seemed fated to keep encountering. Chapter 11. Gifts from the Gods. With the island's location finally known, Perseus still faced an impossible truth. Even knowing exactly where to find her, a single glance at Medusa's face meant certain doom. Courage wouldn't help him here. Strength wouldn't help him. He needed tools built specifically to defeat a curse, and for those he needed the gods. Athena, already invested in his success, gave him a shield, polished to an almost impossible brilliance, bright enough to work as a mirror. The idea, elegant in its simplicity, was this: Perseus would never look at Medusa directly. He would look only at her reflection, letting the bronze surface carry her image to his eyes at one careful remove, enough distance to keep the curse from finding purchase. From Hermes, the swift messenger god, Perseus received a pair of winged sandals, light as breath, capable of carrying him across open ocean, far faster than any ship, straight to an island no sailor would willingly approach. From Hades, ruler of the quiet underworld, came a helm with a stranger gift still: the power of invisibility, allowing its wearer to move entirely unseen, a kind of borrowed shadow. And a blade, curved and impossibly sharp, given by some accounts from Hermes and by others from Hephaestus, the god of the forge. A weapon built for a single precise task, rather than a long fight. Finally, he was given a simple leather pouch, a kaibises, in the old Greek, enchanted to safely hold whatever was placed inside it, no matter how dangerous, without its contents ever touching or harming the one who carried it. Armed with all of this, mirror-bright shield, winged sandals, a helm that erased him from sight, a blade meant for one clean stroke, and a bag built to carry the impossible, Perseus finally turned his path toward the edge of the world, toward the gray shore, toward the cave where the sound of the sea never quite stopped, toward the woman who had spent years there, not hunting anyone, simply waiting for the next stranger the gods would send to try their luck against her. The story's oldest idea. Before we follow Perseus onto that final gray shore, it's worth pausing on the single strangest mechanic in this entire myth, because it's easy to take for granted after hearing the story so many times. Why a gaze? Of all the ways a curse could have been shaped, why did looking specifically become the thing that killed? Scholars who study this myth have spent a long time on that question, and the answer they tend to land on says something quietly profound about how the ancient Greeks thought about looking at another person in the first place. To look at Medusa, in this myth, is to be destroyed by the act of looking itself, not by anything she does, not by any action she takes against you, simply by the act of turning your eyes toward her and seeing her fully as she now was. Flip that around and you get something genuinely strange. For years, men sailed to that island specifically to look at her, to test themselves against her, to prove their courage by facing her directly. And every single one of them, without exception, was destroyed by the very act of trying to see her clearly. There's a reading of this that feels almost too on the nose to say out loud, and yet the myth seems to invite it anyway. A woman, first admired for how she looked. Remember, the whole tragedy begins because men crossed Greece just to see her, is transformed into someone who cannot be looked at all on pain of death. The gaze that once celebrated her becomes the gaze that destroys whoever attempts it. Being looked at and looking become the exact same catastrophic act. Perseus only succeeds because he refuses to participate in that exchange directly. He never looks at Medusa herself, not once in any version of this story. He looks only at her reflection, a mediated, indirect, safely distanced version of her, filtered through polished bronze rather than encountered directly. It's the only way anyone in this entire myth manages to engage with her without either destroying her or being destroyed themselves. And it's worth noticing that even that solution keeps her at arm's length, seen only through an image of an image, never confronted as a person in her own right. Centuries later, this exact dynamic would become something scholars in fields entirely removed from classical studies started calling the gaze. The way looking itself can be an act of power. The way being seen and being reduced to an object of someone else's looking are not always the same thing, but can slide into each other with unsettling ease. Medusa, without anyone in the ancient world ever using that language, had already built an entire myth around exactly that problem, 3,000 years before anyone had the vocabulary to describe it directly. It's one more reason her story has outlasted so many others from the same tradition. Underneath the snakes and the stone and the winged sandals, it is, at its core, a story about what it costs a woman to be looked at. First with desire, then with horror, then, if she's lucky, eventually with understanding. And it never once lets the reader look away from asking which kind of looking they themselves are doing. Part 3. The Grey Shore. If you're joining partway through, here is where we stand. A young man named Perseus, carrying gifts borrowed from 5 different gods, is sailing, or rather flying, on sandals lighter than wind, toward an island most sailors won't speak of by name. He is going there to do the one thing every man before him has failed to do. Somewhere on that island, a woman named Medusa is waiting. Not for him specifically, for whoever the world sends next. Let's go there with him. Chapter 12. The Flight. The winged sandals carried Perseus low over open water, and for the first stretch of the journey, there was nothing to mark the passage of time except the changing color of the sea beneath him. Blue giving way to a deeper, colder blue, and then, gradually, to a gray that seemed to swallow the light rather than reflect it. He had been told by Athena and by the whispered warnings of every sailor who'd refused to take him further what to expect, and still, nothing quite prepares a person for the actual sight of a place the whole world has agreed to be afraid of. The island rose out of the water without announcement. No gentle beach, no welcoming cove, just jagged gray stone, climbing straight up from the surf as though the land itself had braced for impact and never relaxed since. There were no gulls circling it, no green anywhere along its ridges. Even the wind seemed to move differently here, threading through the rocks with a low, constant hiss that Perseus would only later understand wasn't the wind at all. He sat down on the shore carefully, the winged sandals settling him onto wet stone. And it was here, walking the tide line toward the mouth of a shallow cave, that he first understood exactly how many men had come before him. They stood scattered across the upper shore and clustered near the cave entrance. Men, frozen mid-motion, exactly as they'd been the instant their courage ran out. One had a hand raised, as if to shield his eyes too late. Another stood with a foot still lifted, in a half-finished step backward. Their expressions weren't monstrous or twisted in horror, the way later, cruder tellings would insist. They were simply startled. The ordinary human look of someone who had turned a corner expecting one thing and found something else entirely. Stone doesn't preserve terror. It preserves the last unguarded moment before a person understood what was happening to them. Perseus stood among that silent audience for a long moment. This was the part no god's gift could prepare a person for. Not the danger, the weight of it. Every one of these men had believed, right up until the very end, that they would be the exception. He put on the helm of Hades. The change happened without ceremony. No flash of light, no sensation at all. Beyond the strange, quiet certainty that he could no longer be seen. He lifted his bronze shield, angled it carefully so that it faced forward rather than himself, and began to move toward the cave, guided by nothing but the sound of that low hiss, growing steadily louder. Chapter 13. What the shield showed him. Inside, the cave opened into a wider chamber than its narrow mouth suggested, lit by nothing but the pale gray daylight filtering down through cracks in the stone above. And there, in the dim light, Perseus saw them for the first time, reflected safely, in the polished surface of his shield. 3 sisters, asleep. Steno and Euryale lay closest to the entrance, larger than any mortal woman, their forms carrying the strange weight of true immortality. Skin with a faint metallic sheen, wings folded along their backs, catching what little light there was, like beaten bronze. Even sleeping, there was something formidable about them, something that made it easy to understand why so many men had turned back at just the sound of their breathing. And past them, further into the shadow, lay Medusa. Perseus would later be honest in the tellings that survive about what struck him first. Not fear, though fear was certainly present, but a kind of unexpected sorrow. In the shield's reflection, he saw a face that carried none of the monstrous exaggeration the stories he'd grown up with had promised. What he saw, instead, was a woman, asleep, her features still carrying the shape of the beauty that had once brought kings to her door, her breathing slow and even, entirely unaware that the moment that would end her exile, one way or another, had finally arrived. Around her head, where hair should have been, the serpents moved gently, even in sleep, not striking, not hissing with malice, simply shifting the way any sleeper's hair might shift with an uneasy dream. It was, Perseus would later say, harder to look at than he'd expected, not because it was grotesque, because it was sad. He did not allow himself to linger on that thought. A hero paralyzed by sympathy accomplishes nothing, and every second spent standing in that cave was a second closer to one of the immortal sisters waking. He steadied the shield, fixed the reflection of Medusa's sleeping form firmly in view, and drew the curved blade the gods had given him for exactly this single purpose. We are not going to walk through what happened next in detail, because the detail was never really the point of the story, and dwelling on it does nothing but cheapen everything that came before it. What matters, what the old poets actually cared about, is this: it was over in a single motion. Quiet, final, and even in that quiet, something extraordinary happened. Something no one, not even Athena, had fully anticipated. Chapter 14. What rose from the gray sand. From the moment the deed was done, something began to stir in the sand beneath her. A shimmer, a pressure in the air, the unmistakable sense of the world rearranging itself around a birth rather than a death. This is one of the strangest and most beautiful details in the entire myth, and it's the one modern retellings so often rush past in their hurry to get to the next monster or the next hero. Medusa's story does not end in that cave. It transforms there. From the pooling light where she had lain, 2 figures began to take shape, not slowly the way mortal children grow, all at once, fully formed, as though the world had been holding its breath for exactly this moment. The first to rise was a horse unlike any that had ever walked the earth, coat as white as sea foam, a mane that seemed to catch and hold light rather than simply reflect it, and from his shoulders, unfurling like something finally allowed to exist after being held too long in reserve, a pair of enormous wings. He shook himself once, stamped a single hoof against the stone, and where that hoof struck, a thin trickle of fresh water began to bubble up from what had been dry, cursed ground for years. This was Pegasus. Even Perseus, still holding his breath under the helm of invisibility, could only watch as the winged horse reared once, found his footing in the open air as easily as any horse finds it on solid earth, and launched himself upward, out through the cracked stone ceiling and into the gray morning sky, disappearing north, toward the mainland, toward a destiny that had nothing at all to do with the island he'd been born on. The second figure rose more slowly, and where Pegasus had been all lightness and sky, this one carried an entirely different weight. A man, or something built in the shape of a man, larger, broader, carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone born already grown, already formed by purpose rather than childhood. In his hand, from the moment he first stood upright, was a golden sword, as though it had been part of him from the very beginning rather than something picked up afterward. This was Chrysaor, his name meaning, roughly, he of the golden blade. And where his brother would rise into legend among the gods and the stars, Chrysaor's path would carry him instead into the world of mortal kingdoms, dynasties, and the long tangled family trees that connect nearly every corner of Greek myth back to this one gray shore. Two beings, born in the same instant, from the same tragedy, and destined for entirely different kinds of legacy. One soaring, one grounded, one welcomed by gods, one bound for the complicated business of ruling men. It is worth pausing here, before we follow either of them further, to say plainly what the old poets rarely stop to say directly. Medusa was not simply a monster who happened to die that morning. She was, in the truest sense the myths allow, a mother. And in dying she gave the world two entirely new kinds of legend. Whatever had been taken from her, whatever cruelty had shaped the last years of her life, something of her endured, carried forward not as a curse but as wonder. It's one of the few genuinely hopeful threads running through this entire story, and it deserves to be remembered as clearly as the tragedy that came before it. Chapter 15. The Weight in the Bag. Perseus, still working quickly, still aware of the two immortal sisters sleeping only a short distance away, placed what needed to be carried into the enchanted pouch Athena had given him, the Kybeses, built specifically to hold what it now held without harm to the one carrying it. He did not linger to watch where Pegasus had flown or to see what Chrysaor did next. There would be time, later, for the rest of the world to learn what had emerged from that cave. For now his task was simple: leave, quickly and quietly, before Steno and Uriel woke to find their sister gone and their island's long, terrible watch finally broken. He needn't have worried quite as much as he did. The moment the two remaining Gorgon sisters woke and understood what had happened, their grief was immediate and enormous. A sound the old poets describe as louder than any storm the island had ever weathered. A mourning cry that carried out over open water for miles. They rose, wings spread, searching the sky and the shore for whoever had done this, ready to tear the world apart for an answer. But Perseus wore the helm of Hades still, invisible even to immortal eyes, and the winged sandals carried him up and out over open water, before either sister could find so much as a shadow to chase. Behind him, the island fell away into the gray morning haze, the same island where, for years, a woman who had done nothing wrong had waited for a life she could never get back. He flew north, toward the mainland, toward a king who had sent him on this errand, expecting never to see him again. He had no idea yet just how much the world was about to change because of what he was carrying. Part 4. What the head could do. Perseus is flying home now, carrying something no mortal man has ever carried before. Behind him, an island of gray stone and grief. Ahead of him, a king who never expected to see him again. A mother waiting in uncertain safety. And though he doesn't know it yet, a giant holding up the sky, a chained princess, a sea monster, and a prophecy still quietly working itself out somewhere on the road ahead. Let's follow him the rest of the way. Chapter 16. The Giant Who Wanted Rest. The first stop on Perseus's long flight home rarely makes it into the shorter versions of this story, but it's worth telling because it says something important about what he was now carrying and how the world reacted to it. Somewhere along the coast of what the Greeks called Libya, the general term they used for the wide stretch of North Africa west of Egypt, Perseus came down to rest in the kingdom of a titan named Atlas. Atlas, if the name is familiar, is the same figure condemned in the deepest layers of Greek myth to hold up the sky itself on his shoulders, a punishment handed down after the war between the Titans and the Olympians, one Atlas would carry for the rest of eternity. But in some of the older versions of this tale, before that punishment fully set in, Atlas ruled a wealthy western kingdom, famous for a garden of golden apples that he guarded jealously. Perseus, tired from the flight and looking only for a night's hospitality, asked Atlas for shelter, a simple request, the kind any traveler in the ancient world could reasonably expect. Atlas refused. Some tellings say an old prophecy had warned him that a son of Zeus would one day come to steal his golden apples, and the giant, weary and paranoid, saw that threat in every stranger who approached his gates. He turned Perseus away roughly, even moved to force him off his land entirely. Perseus, exhausted and unwilling to fight a titan by strength alone, did the only thing that made sense. He turned away, opened the kaivises just enough, and let Atlas see what he carried. The giant who held up the sky went still in an instant, his enormous frame turning to stone, mountain-sized, his shoulders still braced upward out of old habit even in stillness. The old poets say this is, in fact, how the Atlas Mountains came to be. A giant turned to rock, still holding the sky above him, exactly where Perseus left him. It's a strange, almost accidental use of Medusa's power. Not vengeance, not even really self-defense. Just a tired traveler, turned away by an inhospitable host, using the one tool he had to make an old giant's refusal permanent. Whatever you make of that exchange, it tells you something the rest of this story keeps circling back to. The head Perseus carried didn't distinguish between monsters and giants and ordinary frightened men. It simply did what it did to whoever looked. Chapter 17. The Woman Chained to the Rock. Continuing north and east along the coastline, Perseus passed a kingdom called Ethiopia, ruled by a king named Cepheus and his queen, Cassiopeia. Flying low along the shoreline, scanning the coast the way any traveler might simply out of habit, he noticed something that didn't belong there. A shape against the rocks, pale and still. At first, easy to mistake for another outcropping of pale stone. As he came closer, the shape resolved into something far worse. A young woman, chained to the rock face just above the waterline, standing utterly alone against an empty sea. Her name was Andromeda, and her situation, once Perseus landed nearby and coaxed the story out of her, was the kind of tragedy that had nothing to do with anything she'd actually done. Her mother, Queen Cassiopeia, had made the kind of boast that never ends well in these old stories, declaring in a moment of pride that her daughter's beauty surpassed even that of the Nereids, the sea nymphs who served under Poseidon's court. It's a small, human kind of vanity, the sort of exaggeration a parent might make about a beloved child without thinking twice. But the sea does not forgive small vanities easily, and the Nereids, insulted, carried their complaint straight to Poseidon. Furious at the slight, the same god, worth remembering, whose own actions had once set Medusa's entire tragedy in motion. Poseidon sent a monstrous sea creature, Cetus, to ravage the coastline of Cepheus's kingdom. Storms battered the shore, ships were lost. The kingdom's people grew desperate, and when they consulted an oracle for a solution, the answer they received was as merciless as it was familiar. The only way to appease the god's anger was to offer up the king's own daughter, chained to the rocks, as a sacrifice to the very creature sent to punish her mother's pride. Andromeda had done nothing. She had made no boast, offended no god, asked for none of this, and yet here she stood, waiting for a monster to arrive and end her life, for a sentence her mother had spoken. If the pattern feels familiar by now, it should. This entire story, Medusa's story, and now Andromeda's, keep circling back to the same quiet, uncomfortable truth. In these old myths, it was so often women who paid for the pride, the desire, or the fury of people with far more power than they had. Chapter 18. A different kind of rescue. Perseus did not hesitate. He struck a bargain on the spot with Cepheus and Cassiopeia. Watching from the shore in anguish they could do nothing about. If he could save Andromeda from the creature, she would become his wife. Desperate and out of options, the king and queen agreed. When Cetus finally emerged from the water, a vast, churning shape moving toward the rock where Andromeda still stood chained, Perseus didn't reach for his sword. He reached instead for the one weapon he now carried that made every other weapon unnecessary. He opened the enchanted pouch just enough, angled what lay within away from his own eyes and toward the approaching creature, and in a single instant the vast shape of Cetus went entirely still, not harmed in any violent sense, simply and completely turned to stone, mid-motion, exactly as every unfortunate man on Medusa's island once had been. The threat that had terrorized an entire kingdom for weeks ended not in a battle, but in a single, quiet, absolute stillness. Perseus freed Andromeda from her chains himself, and the two of them, by every account genuinely fond of one another, rather than simply bound by a hasty bargain, would go on to marry, eventually founding a family line that later Greek historians proudly traced their own royal houses back to. It's worth noticing, before we move on, what this scene tells us about the object Perseus now carried. In Medusa's own story, that same power had been treated as a monstrous curse, proof of how far she'd fallen, evidence for every accusation that she was dangerous and other and less than human. And yet here, in Perseus's hands, that exact same power was being used to save an innocent woman's life. Praised by an entire kingdom as a miracle rather than a horror. Nothing about the power itself had changed. Only who was holding it, and what story people had decided to tell about them. Chapter 19. A wedding and a second suitor's rage. The wedding of Perseus and Andromeda should have been a simple, joyful affair, and for a while it was. A hall full of guests, a grateful kingdom, a hero and the woman he'd saved, finally allowed a moment of peace. But Andromeda had already been promised to someone else before Perseus ever arrived. Her uncle, a man named Phineus, had been betrothed to her long before Cetus rose from the water. And Phineus, notably, had done nothing to save her from the rock. He had simply waited, safely inland, for the sacrifice to run its course, apparently prepared to let his niece die rather than risk anything himself. Now, seeing another man married to the woman he still considered his, Phineus arrived at the wedding feast with an armed company, determined to claim her by force. What followed was chaotic, a genuine battle breaking out in the middle of a wedding hall, guests scattering, weapons drawn between men who moments earlier had been drinking together in celebration. Perseus, outnumbered and unwilling to let the day end in his own death or Andromeda's loss, made the same choice he'd made against the giant Atlas and the sea monster Cetus. He called out a warning to anyone still loyal to him, telling them to look away, and then one final time he lifted what he carried. Phineus and his men were left exactly where they stood, a permanent, silent monument to a claim that was never really his to make, frozen mid-charge in the hall where a wedding feast had, moments before, been underway. It's a smaller, less famous episode than the sea monster or the Titan's mountains, but it belongs in the story because it shows something the myth keeps returning to. Every single time Perseus used Medusa's power, it was in defense of himself, of Andromeda, of people who had done nothing to deserve the violence coming for them. The same power that had once been used to punish an innocent woman was, in every single instance after her death, used only to protect the innocent. Chapter 20. The King Who Doubted. Perseus finally returned to Seriphos to find the situation he'd left behind had grown worse in his absence. Polydectes, confident that sending Perseus after Medusa had been a clever and permanent way to remove him, had spent the intervening time pressing his unwanted attentions on Denis far more aggressively, certain there would be no one left to stop him. When Perseus arrived at the palace, Polydectes and his court greeted the news of his return with open mockery. Of course he'd failed, they assumed. No man returned from that island. Whatever excuse he'd concocted to explain his survival, they weren't interested in hearing it. Perseus, by the old accounts, said very little. He simply asked the assembled court whether they'd like proof. What happened next has become one of the most quoted moments in the entire myth cycle, precisely because of how quiet and inevitable it feels in the telling. Perseus lifted what he carried and asked the king and his court to look if they doubted him so badly. They looked, and in that same instant, the entire hall, the mocking courtiers, and Polydectes himself went as still and silent as the men scattered across Medusa's island shore had been for years. A room full of people who had spent months threatening a woman with no one to protect her found themselves in one heartbeat transformed into exactly the kind of frozen monument they'd once assumed only monsters could create. Dictys, the humble fisherman who had raised Perseus and Polydectes' own brother, was made king of Seriphos in his place. A rare instance in these myths of a genuinely kind and ordinary man receiving a happy ending simply because he deserved one. Chapter 21. The prophecy finds its way. There remained still the matter of Acrisius, the king who had locked his own daughter in a bronze room and set his infant grandson adrift on the open sea rather than risk the future an oracle had promised him. Perseus, now a celebrated hero with a wife, a rescued mother, and an extraordinary weapon, had no interest in seeking out his grandfather for revenge. If anything, the old stories are careful to paint him as someone who had grown past bitterness. He wanted, if anything, simply to know his family, to close the distance a frightened old king's fear had created decades earlier. Acrisius, hearing that his grandson was alive, celebrated, and now traveling in his direction, did not share that hope. Old fears rarely loosen their grip just because circumstances have changed. And the king fled his own city rather than risk the meeting, taking refuge instead in a neighboring kingdom. It was there, entirely by accident, that fate finally caught up with him. A funeral games, athletic competitions held in honor of a local ruler, happened to be taking place in the very city Acrisius had fled to. And Perseus, unaware his grandfather was even present among the crowd, took part in the discus throw. The old poets are unanimous on one detail. There was no malice in it, no recognition, no confrontation, no violence intended by anyone involved. A gust of wind simply caught the discus mid-flight, carrying it off its expected path and into the crowd, where it struck and killed an old man who happened to be standing exactly where fate had, apparently, always intended him to stand. It was Acrisius. The prophecy, avoided for decades through locked rooms and drifting chests and years of careful fear, had found its way to completion regardless. Not through revenge, not through cruelty, but through the plain, indifferent workings of chance. Perseus, devastated to learn who he'd struck, buried his grandfather with full honors and grieved a man he'd never truly gotten the chance to know. It's one of the oldest lessons this kind of myth ever tries to teach. The harder you run from a fate, the more directly you tend to walk into it. Chapter 22. The city he could not bring himself to rule. Grief-stricken over what had happened at the funeral games, Perseus found he could no longer bring himself to return to Argos and claim the throne that was now rightfully his by inheritance. To rule the very city where his grandfather had once feared him felt To him, like an unbearable irony, a crown built on the exact death he'd never wanted. So he did something almost no hero in these old stories ever does. He arranged a trade. A cousin of his, a king named Megapenthes, ruled a nearby city called Tiryns. Perseus proposed they simply exchange kingdoms. He would take Tiryns and hand Argos over to his cousin instead, so that neither man would ever have to look at that particular throne and think of a grandfather's death on a discus field. Megapenthes agreed, and the exchange was made peacefully, without a single drop of blood spilled over it, which is itself a small miracle in a myth cycle usually built entirely out of succession wars and family bloodshed. But Perseus didn't stop at Tiryns. Restless and looking for a fresh start unburdened by prophecy, he founded an entirely new city nearby, on a low, defensible hill in the Argive plain. According to the old accounts, he named it Mycenae, supposedly after the cap or mikes of his sword sheath, which fell to the ground there and struck him as a sign. Or, in another version, after a spring he discovered on the site while thirsty from the day's travel. Whatever the true origin of the name, the city Perseus founded there would go on to become one of the most powerful kingdoms in the entire Bronze Age Aegean world, the same Mycenae that would, generations later, send Agamemnon and his fleet to Troy. The golden masks, the towering lion gate, the palace walls so massive that later Greeks assumed only giants could have built them. All of it traces back, in myth, to a hero who simply wanted a fresh start, far from a throne haunted by a grandfather he never meant to kill. It's a detail worth holding on to, because it complicates the easy version of Perseus as simply the monster slayer. He was also, by the end of his story, a builder, a founder of dynasties, a man who took the worst day of his life and turned it, eventually, into one of the great cities of the ancient world. Chapter 23. Where the Head Finally Rested. Perseus did not keep the head as a trophy for the rest of his days. He understood, in the way heroes in these stories often eventually do, that something with this much power required a home far more careful than a mortal man's household. He gave it, in the end, to Athena, the very goddess whose curse had created it in the first place and whose guidance had made its removal possible. Athena placed the Gorgon's likeness at the very center of her shield, the Aegis, where it would remain from that point forward. A symbol carried into battle by the goddess of wisdom herself, meant to strike fear into anyone who dared oppose her. There is something worth sitting with in that final image, and it's a thread we'll return to properly in the last part of this story. Medusa's face, the very thing a goddess once used to punish and exile her, became, after her death, the single most powerful protective symbol in the ancient world. Warriors painted it on their shields. Temples carved it above their doorways. Households hung it near their entrances, believing that her stare, once a curse, could now guard the people she'd never had the chance to protect in life. It is, in its own strange way, the beginning of her redemption, not given to her by the gods who wronged her, not chosen by her own hand, but slowly, quietly built by the countless ordinary people across the ancient world who looked at her face and decided, on their own, that it deserved to mean something other than monster. We're not finished with her story yet, though, because even in death Medusa had one final gift left to give the world, a gift born from her own blood, and from it one of the strangest and most beautiful legends in the entire myth cycle. That's where we'll go next, in the story's final chapters. What became of the hero? It's easy, in a story this dense with gods and monsters, to let Perseus disappear once his part in Medusa's tale is finished. But he lived on for decades after that flight home, and the shape of the rest of his life is worth knowing, if only because it tells you what the Greeks thought, a hero deserved once the adventure was over. By most accounts, Perseus and Andromeda had a long and, by the standards of these myths, remarkably stable marriage, itself almost a small miracle, given how many of these stories end in betrayal, curses, or tragedy for the couples involved. Together they had several children, and it's through this bloodline, threading down through the generations, that later Greeks traced the ancestry of some of their most celebrated heroes. Heracles himself was said to descend from Perseus several generations down the family tree, which meant that in the Greek imagination, an unbroken line ran from a violated priestess on a gray island, through Medusa's own killer, all the way down to the single most famous strongman in the whole of Greek myth. Perseus ruled first at Tiryns, and then oversaw the founding and rise of Mycenae, and the old accounts generally describe his later reign as peaceful and prosperous, a marked contrast to the chaos and prophecy-driven fear that had defined nearly every year of his childhood and young adulthood. It's almost as if the myth wanted to reward him, after everything, with the one thing none of the kings in this story had ever managed to hold on to for long, an uneventful old age. Even his death, in the versions that describe one at all, avoids the violent, ironic endings so many Greek heroes are given. Some later writers connect Perseus to a conflict with the god Dionysus over control of Argos, though the details are thin and inconsistently told compared to the rest of his story. The more common tradition simply lets him live out his years as a respected king and eventually die of natural causes, at which point he and Andromeda were both said to have been placed among the stars, joining the rest of that chaotic wedding night cast of characters in the night sky, where you can still find them today. It's a quieter ending than the story's early chapters might have led you to expect. No final monster, no last desperate quest, just a man who had spent his youth doing exactly what the gods and a cruel king demanded of him, finally allowed to grow old. Whether that peace was truly earned or simply granted by poets eager to give their hero a happy final chapter is a question the myth never quite answers. But it's worth noticing one more time the asymmetry sitting underneath the whole story. Perseus got a peaceful old age, a dynasty, a city, and a place in the stars. Medusa got a curse she never asked for, a handful of years on a gray shore, and a single violent morning that the rest of the world spent 3,000 years arguing over how to remember. The complete story of Medusa. Part 5. The blood, the stars, and what came after. We're near the end now. Perseus has flown home. A grandfather has died exactly the way it was always going to happen. Not through violence aimed at him, but through the plain indifference of a gust of wind. A new city rises on a hill in the Argive plain. You might think that's where a story like this ends. A hero returns, a villain falls, a weapon is mounted somewhere safe. But Medusa's story never quite behaves the way you expect it to. Even her blood had one more thing to say. Chapter 24. Two kinds of blood. Here is a detail the old poets loved, and one that later writers, physicians especially, kept returning to for centuries afterward. When Medusa died, her blood did not behave like any other creature's. Drawn from two different sides of her body, it carried two entirely different powers. As though even in death, some remnant of the injustice done to her had split into opposite outcomes. Blood drawn from the veins on her left side, the old accounts say, was a poison beyond anything else in the ancient world, potent enough to kill instantly. So dangerous that later heroes would go on to weaponize it, dipping arrowheads and blades into vials of it, carrying a piece of that gray island's tragedy into wars fought generations after her death. But blood drawn from the veins on her right side did the opposite. It could raise the dead. Sit with that for a moment, the way we've tried to sit with each strange turn in this story. From the same body, the same tragedy, came both the deadliest poison the ancient world knew and the only substance capable of undoing death itself. It's hard not to hear an echo in that detail of everything that came before it. A woman who had been made, against her will, into something the world called purely monstrous, who turned out even afterward to be carrying something life-giving inside her the whole time. The gods, in their usual fashion, wasted no time deciding what to do with something this malleable. Chapter 25. The Physician Who Went Too Far. The vials of Gorgon blood eventually made their way to a healer named Asclepius, son of Apollo, a mortal-born physician so skilled that later generations would worship him as the god of medicine itself. Asclepius received the blood, by most tellings, as a gift from Athena, the same goddess who seemed to spend the years after Medusa's death quietly redistributing pieces of her. The shield here, the blood there, as though still working out what to do with the consequences of a curse she'd never taken responsibility for. And Asclepius did exactly what you'd hope a gifted physician might do with a substance capable of reversing death. He used it, carefully at first, healing the sick, easing suffering, building a reputation across Greece as someone who could hold back the natural order just slightly, just enough to save a life that might otherwise have been lost. But the right side blood, the healing half, kept working. And a man who has tasted the ability to undo death rarely stops at moderation. Asclepius began, according to several old accounts, raising the dead outright, pulling people back across a line the world had never meant to be crossed twice. Hippolytus, killed by his own panicked horses. Others besides him, mortal by mortal, brought back by a physician who had simply never been told no. It couldn't last, and everyone in these stories seems to have known it wouldn't. Hades, ruler of the underworld, noticed the dead arriving late or not arriving at all, and complained bitterly and with good reason to his brother Zeus. The natural order, the one boundary even the gods generally respected, was being quietly unraveled by a mortal with a vial of blood he was never supposed to be trusted with. Zeus's answer was swift and absolute. He struck Asclepius down with a thunderbolt, ending the life of the one man who had ever truly understood what Medusa's blood could give back to the world. It's a small, sad footnote to an already sad story. The idea that the one purely good thing to come out of Medusa's death, the power to heal rather than harm, still managed to end in another death, another overreach. Another god deciding a mortal had gotten too close to something they weren't meant to hold. Even her gift, it seems, wasn't allowed to simply be a gift. And yet the story doesn't end in that lightning strike either. Asclepius's symbol, a serpent coiled around a staff, drawn directly from the healing power in that Gorgon blood, survived him by thousands of years. It's the same symbol, essentially unchanged, that still marks ambulances and hospitals and pharmacies today. Every time you see that staff and serpent, you are looking, in a very real sense, at the last surviving piece of Medusa that the ancient world decided to keep. Chapter 26. A Family Written into the Sky. There is one more piece of this story the old Greeks loved to tell, and it takes us, quite literally, upward. After Andromeda's rescue, and after the long, eventful road that followed it, the gods chose to honor nearly everyone involved in that single chaotic sequence of events by placing them among the stars. Cepheus, the king, became a constellation. Cassiopeia, the queen whose careless boast had started the entire crisis, became one too, bound in some tellings to a throne that circles the pole forever, tipped upside down for half of every night, an eternal, gentle reminder of the pride that nearly cost her daughter's life. Andromeda herself was placed in the sky nearby, still recognizable by the long chain of stars that once marked the rocks she was chained to. Perseus stands close by as well in the winter sky, often drawn holding a sword in one hand and, in the oldest depictions, a severed snake-haired head in the other. Ancient stargazers even gave one particular star in that constellation a name that has survived into modern astronomy, Algol, from the Arabic for the ghoul. A star ancient observers noticed flickered strangely in brightness, and which they associated, across cultures and centuries, with the eye of the Gorgon herself. And Pegasus, of course, got a constellation of his own, a great winged square of stars, visible across much of the world in autumn, still galloping across the night sky exactly as he once burst from the sand of that gray island, carrying no memory of the tragedy that made him. It's worth noticing what this tells us. The ancient Greeks didn't just tell Medusa's story around a campfire and let it end there. They wrote her family, her death, her children, the people connected to her killer, directly into the architecture of the night sky, where anyone, in any generation, could look up and find the whole story still unfolding above them. Even now, on a clear autumn night, you can trace nearly this entire myth with nothing but your own eyes and a dark enough sky. Perseus, Andromeda, Cassiopeia, Cepheus, Pegasus rising just beside them. A 3,000-year-old tragedy, quietly rewritten as a permanent fixture of the heavens. Chapter 27. The Face on the Doorway. With Perseus's part of the story finished and Medusa's blood scattered across its final uses, we're left with the question that actually matters most 3,000 years later. What did the ancient world decide to do with her memory? The answer is almost nothing like what you'd expect from a monster. Long before Perseus ever set out for that island, and for centuries after, the image of Medusa's face, wide-eyed, snake-haired, tongue, often bared in a fierce grimace, appeared everywhere across the Greek and later Roman world, and almost never as a warning to stay away from her. It appeared as protection. The Greeks called this kind of image a gorgonion, and they carved it or painted it or wove it into nearly everything that needed guarding. It stared out from temple pediments, warding off whatever might approach with bad intent. It appeared on shields and breastplates, meant to unsettle an enemy before a single blow was struck. It showed up on doorways, on floor mosaics at the threshold of wealthy homes, on coins, on roof tiles, on the rims of drinking cups, even tattooed or painted near the entrances of ordinary houses that had nothing to do with kings or gods at all. This is what scholars call apotropaic imagery, imagery whose entire purpose is to turn evil away, to frighten off the very danger it resembles. And it tells us something the monster version of this myth conveniently leaves out. The ancient world, on some instinctive level, understood Medusa not as a source of evil to be feared, but as a guardian, a face fierce enough to stand between ordinary people and whatever wanted to hurt them. They put her likeness at their front doors, not to keep her out, to keep everything else out, using the very face a goddess had once used to punish her. Chapter 27.5. Stone faces that have outlasted empires. If you ever find yourself standing in front of certain ruins in Greece and Italy, you don't have to imagine the Gorgonion. You can still see it carved directly into stone that has survived for well over 2,000 years. On the island of Corfu, the pediment of what was once the Temple of Artemis holds one of the largest and best preserved Gorgon images anywhere in the ancient world. An enormous running figure, knees bent, snakes coiling from her waist, flanked by two great cats, dominating the entire front of the building. It's one of the earliest large-scale examples of monumental Greek architectural sculpture ever found, dating back roughly to the start of the 6th century BCE, and archaeologists generally agree on what it was doing there. Not decoration, protection, a warning carved 30 feet wide across the most visible part of the entire temple, aimed at anything that might approach with harmful intent. Sicily has its own versions, carved into temple metopes at Selinus. Athens has fragments built into the Acropolis itself. Etruscan tombs in central Italy carried the same face into the world of the dead, believing it could guard the deceased on whatever journey came next. The image traveled remarkably well, too, across centuries and across entirely different cultures. Roman legionaries wore it on parade armor. Byzantine artisans, centuries after the old gods had officially been abandoned for Christianity, kept carving Gorgon faces into church walls anyway. Old habits and older fears apparently outlasting entire religions. Even today, tourists photograph an enormous carved Medusa head lying sideways at the bottom of a Byzantine-era cistern beneath modern Istanbul. Its exact origin still debated by historians. Its protective purpose almost certainly the same one the Greeks had in mind 15 centuries earlier. What all of this tells you is that the Gorgonian wasn't a passing decorative trend confined to one century or one city-state. It was a genuinely long-lived piece of folk belief, carried forward by ordinary builders and craftsmen across an enormous stretch of geography and time, all of them apparently agreeing on the same basic idea. Put her face where danger might enter, and danger will think twice. It's a strange kind of immortality for a woman the myths insist was mortal. Perseus's sword outlived him by only as long as it took to rust. Medusa's face outlived every empire that ever carved it. Chapter 27 and 3/4. The historians who didn't believe in snakes. Not every ancient writer was content to leave Medusa as pure myth. Some of them, particularly the more historically minded Greek and Roman authors, tried to explain her the way a modern skeptic might try to explain any old legend, by looking for the ordinary, human kernel buried underneath the fantastic version. The historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, offers one of the more striking of these attempts. In his account, the Gorgons weren't monsters or goddesses at all, but a tribe of fierce warrior women living somewhere in ancient Libya, a rival in his telling to the equally famous Amazons, and locked in something like a long-running territorial war with them. Perseus's expedition, in this rationalized version, becomes something closer to a military campaign, a young leader conquering a formidable enemy people, rather than a solitary hero facing down a supernatural curse. It's a strange thing to do to a myth, strip out the snakes and the stone gaze, and replace them with geopolitics. But it tells you something interesting about how differently later, more historically minded generations of Greeks and Romans related to these old stories than the poets who first told them. Where Hesiod and Ovid were interested in cosmic genealogy and personal tragedy, writers like Diodorus were often trying to fold myth back into something resembling plausible history, hunting for the real tribe, the real war, the real geography behind every fantastical detail. Herodotus, writing centuries earlier and generally far more cautious about separating fact from legend, doesn't commit to this theory outright, but does note in passing the Greek habit of locating monstrous or foreign peoples at the vague edges of the known world, Libya, Scythia, the far edges of Africa, precisely the kind of blank space on a map where a culture tends to project whatever it fears or doesn't understand. None of this solves Medusa exactly. If anything, it adds one more version to a myth that was never short on versions. But it's worth knowing that even in antiquity, thoughtful people were already asking the same kind of question you might ask today: what is this story actually about, underneath all the fantastical decoration? A war between rival peoples at the edge of the known world, a meditation on violated sanctuary and misplaced blame, a genealogy exercise mapping out the strange, sprawling family tree of the gods. The honest answer is probably all of them, layered on top of each other by different tellers in different centuries, each reaching for the version of the story that made the most sense of their own particular moment. Chapter 28. Two poets, two very different women. If you've ever heard two contradictory versions of Medusa's story, one where she's simply born a monster, no tragedy attached, and one like the one we've been telling, where she's a violated priestess punished for someone else's crime, you're not misremembering. Both versions exist, and they come from two poets writing centuries apart, with very different things on their minds. The older version comes from Hesiod, writing around the 7th century BCE, in a work called the Theogony, essentially an attempt to map out the entire family tree of the gods, from the beginning of the universe onward. Hesiod's Medusa is simply one of 3 Gorgon sisters, born monstrous. No backstory of assault or punishment attached at all. In his telling, she and Poseidon are lovers, not victim and violator, and her death at Perseus's hands is simply one event in a long chain of divine genealogy, notable mainly for what it produces afterward. Pegasus and Chrysaor, bursting from her severed neck, the version that has stayed with us, the one this whole story has been built around, the temple, the assault, Athena's furious curse, comes from Ovid, a Roman poet writing 7 centuries later in the Metamorphoses. Ovid was working in an entirely different tradition, one obsessed with transformation, injustice, and the particular cruelty of how power moves through the world. His Medusa isn't born a monster. She's made into one. And Ovid makes sure his reader feels the unfairness of that transformation, rather than simply accepting it as myth logic. There's a third voice worth mentioning too, quieter than the other two. A later Greek writer, working from a handbook of myths known today as the Bibliotheca, and traditionally attributed to a scholar called Apollodorus, gives us many of the connective details that make this story hang together as a single narrative, the exact sequence of the Grey, the specific gifts from each god, the order of events on the flight home. Where Hesiod gives us the bare bones, and Ovid gives us the emotional core, this later compiler gives us the plot, the careful practical scaffolding that lets all the pieces fit. Neither poet is more correct than the other. This is the nature of oral myth, retold and reshaped across 1,000 years by storytellers responding to their own moment. But it's worth knowing that the version most of us grew up with, the sympathetic one, the one where Medusa is a survivor rather than a birth monster, is largely Ovid's addition to a much older story. He's the one who turned a simple genealogy entry into a tragedy. And it's his version, not Hesiod's, that has quietly won the argument over the last 2,000 years. Chapter 29. The painting that wouldn't look away. Skip forward, now past the fall of Rome, past 1,000 years of retellings, all the way to Italy at the very end of the 16th century. And you'll find one of the strangest and most talked about paintings to ever come out of the myth. The Italian painter Caravaggio, commissioned to create a ceremonial shield decoration, chose to paint Medusa's severed head at the exact instant of death. Mouth open, eyes wide, blood still visibly leaving the neck. The serpents caught mid-writhe as though the painting itself hadn't quite settled yet. It's a deeply unusual choice for the period. Rather than showing a monster or even showing Perseus as the triumphant hero, Caravaggio gives the viewer nothing but Medusa's own face, caught in what looks less like fury and more like shock. Art historians have spent a long time on that expression, because it doesn't read the way earlier Gorgon imagery does. It isn't menacing, it's startled, almost human. A face that seems to still be realizing what has just happened to it. Some historians have pointed out that Caravaggio reportedly used his own face as the model, turning the painting into a strange, layered act of self-portraiture. The artist placing his own likeness into the mask of a woman perpetually punished for a violence that was never her fault. A century and a half later, the sculptor Antonio Canova took the opposite approach entirely, carving a marble Perseus holding Medusa's head aloft in cool, classical triumph. A statue so admired in its own time that it was purchased for display in the Vatican, standing, quite literally, on a pedestal once occupied by an ancient Apollo. Where Caravaggio gave the viewer her shock, Canova gave the world her conqueror's calm. Two artists working 150 years apart, choosing to freeze two entirely different moments of the exact same myth. Whatever each artist intended, both works have become among the most reproduced images connected to Medusa in existence. And it's worth noticing what one of them at least chose to capture. Not a monster mid-attack. A person, mid-death, still visibly surprised by what the world had decided to do to her. Chapter 29 and a half. A name that outgrew its story, long before modern retelling started reclaiming Medusa as a symbol of survival. Her name had already quietly slipped into fields that have nothing to do with mythology at all. Look up at a jellyfish drifting through open water, its bell pulsing, its long tentacles trailing beneath it like something out of that gray shore cave, and you're looking at an animal whose free-swimming adult stage biologists still call, to this day, a Medusa. The name was chosen deliberately, centuries ago, by naturalists who saw in those trailing, softly waving tentacles an obvious echo of a certain snake-haired face, proof that her image had become so universally recognizable that scientists reached for it instinctively, even when cataloging creatures that had nothing to do with ancient Greece. Medicine borrowed her too. Physicians used the term caput medusae, literally head of Medusa, to describe a specific and visually striking symptom of severe liver disease in which swollen, engorged veins radiate outward from the navel across the abdomen, in a pattern doctors have found impossible not to compare to a head full of writhing serpents. It's a clinical term still taught in medical schools today, one more small, unexpected thread connecting a modern hospital ward to a cave at the edge of the ancient world. Even geology got in on it. On the volcanic Italian island of Vulcano and in various formations elsewhere in the Mediterranean world, unusual rock structures shaped by lava flow have picked up the nickname Medusa's hair for the same obvious visual reason. A wine grape used in parts of Italy carries her name. A minor planet discovered in the 20th century and catalogued among the thousands of asteroids drifting through the solar system was named after her as well. There's something quietly remarkable in all of this if you step back and look at it as a whole. Most figures from ancient mythology stay contained within mythology. Zeus, Athena, Poseidon, familiar names, but names that mostly stay inside stories, statues, and the occasional brand of shampoo. Medusa's name escaped that containment centuries ago and kept spreading into biology textbooks and hospital charts and geology field guides, carried along by nothing more than the sheer visual power of a single image. A face crowned in serpents. It's worth wondering, too, what it says about her, that of all the monstrous, tragic figures in Greek myth, hers is the one that kept getting reached for, generation after generation, whenever someone needed a shorthand for something both beautiful and frightening at once. Not evil exactly, not safe either, just genuinely, memorably both. Chapter 30. What she became, which brings us finally to now. Over the last several decades, Medusa has undergone a transformation almost as strange as the one Athena forced on her all those centuries ago. Except this time, it's one nobody cursed her into. Writers, artists, and scholars, particularly those examining the myth through the lens of what happened to her rather than what she supposedly did, have increasingly read her story as one of the oldest and clearest examples in Western literature of a survivor being blamed for her own violation. A woman is harmed inside the one place that should have protected her. The authority she trusted responds not with justice, but with punishment, aimed squarely at her, rather than at the one who caused the harm. She is cast out, reframed as dangerous, and spends years being hunted by men eager to prove themselves against her, right up until one of them finally succeeds and is celebrated as a hero for it. Told that plainly, without the snakes and the stone-turning gaze, it stops sounding like ancient myth at all. And that's precisely why so many modern retellings, novels, poems, gallery installations, even a striking bronze statue installed across from a courthouse, depicting Medusa holding Perseus's severed head rather than the reverse, have chosen to reclaim her, not as a monster to be feared, but as a woman who survived something unspeakable and was punished for surviving it. It's worth being honest about the limits of that reading, too. Medusa is a nearly 3,000-year-old myth, shaped and reshaped by dozens of poets with different intentions. And no single version of her, not Hesiod's, not Ovid's, not ours, is the one true original waiting underneath all the others. What we have instead is a story flexible enough to hold whatever a given age most needs it to mean. A monster to Hesiod's audience, a tragedy to Ovid's, a protector to the households who carved her face above their doors, a symbol of survival to a modern audience finally willing to ask who actually failed her. That flexibility, more than the snakes or the stone gaze, might be the real reason she's lasted this long. She started as a priestess who wanted nothing more than a quiet devotion to a goddess she trusted. She ended as a face carved above doorways across an entire ancient world, still standing guard 3,000 years later over people who never even learn her name. And somewhere between those two things, spread across a whole night sky, a hero's new city on a hill, and a symbol still stitched onto every ambulance and pharmacy sign in the modern world, is the actual story, not the monster, and not quite the martyr either. Just a woman the world could never decide what to do with, so it kept telling her story instead, generation after generation, each one hoping to finally get it right. Maybe this one didn't either. But we try to ask the question the old poets so rarely bothered with. Not what did she do, but what was done to her. There are just two more threads left to pull before we truly finish. Chapter 31, The Face That Kept Reappearing. One last thread is worth pulling before we truly close the door on this story, because it explains why you likely knew Medusa's name before you ever heard a single detail of what actually happened to her. In the 20th century, a struggling fashion house in Milan needed a logo, something bold enough to anchor an entire brand identity, instantly recognizable from across a runway or a magazine page. The designer chose the Gorgon's head, not by the company's own explanation as a symbol of monstrosity, but for the same reason the ancient Greeks first carved her above their doorways, as a mark of magnetism, of a gaze so powerful no one could look away from it. That fashion house was Versace, and for decades now, Medusa's face has stared out from handbags, belts, and storefronts in nearly every major city in the world. An ancient apotropaic symbol, quietly rebranded as a marker of luxury. Film and television found her too, usually leaning on the older, simpler Hesiod version rather than Ovid's tragedy. A straightforward monster for a hero to defeat, snake-haired and stone-gazed, appearing in adventure films built around the Perseus myth, in animated retellings aimed at children, and eventually in modern young adult fiction, where a popular series of novels reimagined her, briefly, as a lonely, embittered figure running a garden statuary business in suburban America. Stone visitors arranged neatly among the old, Video games and graphic novels have leaned into her more recently, and here it's worth noting a real shift in tone. Where mid-century adaptations were almost uniformly content to let her be simply frightening, more recent works, novels told from her own point of view, gallery installations, that bronze statue we mentioned earlier, depicting her holding Perseus's severed head rather than the other way around, have deliberately flipped the perspective, asking audiences to sit inside her experience rather than simply admire the hero who ended it. It's a genuinely unusual afterlife for a mythological figure. Most monsters from these old stories stay monsters century after century, comfortably one-dimensional. Medusa is one of the very few who has been allowed, slowly and unevenly, to become a person again. The very thing Ovid first tried to give her 2,000 years ago, and the very thing a curse, and then a sword, and then several thousand years of careless retelling, kept trying to take away. Chapter 32. Why the ancients kept blaming the woman. It would be easy to treat Athena's cruelty toward Medusa as an isolated moment of divine pettiness. One goddess, one bad decision, in one otherwise unremarkable myth. But widen the lens even slightly across the rest of Greek mythology, and a much larger, much more uncomfortable pattern comes into view. Callisto, a nymph sworn to the goddess Artemis, was pursued and violated by Zeus, and when Artemis discovered what had happened, her fury landed not on Zeus, but on Callisto. Transformed into a bear and driven from the very company of huntresses she'd once belonged to, Io, another of Zeus's victims, was turned into a cow and hounded across the known world by a monstrous, ever-watchful herdsman, set upon her by a jealous Hera who blamed the girl rather than her husband. Even Medusa's own future rescuer's mother-in-law's family carries an echo of it. Cassiopeia's simple boast nearly costs her daughter Andromeda her life, the punishment for a parent's pride landing squarely on the child instead. Over and over, across dozens of these old stories, the same basic shape repeats itself. A god desires or is offended by a mortal woman. Consequences follow, and the consequences, with startling consistency, land on the woman, punished, transformed, exiled, or killed, while the god responsible faces little or nothing at all. Scholars who study this pattern point to something structural in how these myths functioned for the societies that told them. The gods, almost by definition, could not easily be shown facing real consequences. Their power made genuine accountability narratively awkward, even dangerous to depict, since a mortal audience being taught to imagine punishing a god was not a lesson any ancient priesthood particularly wanted circulating. Punishing the mortal woman instead solved that narrative problem neatly. It let the story acknowledge that something had gone wrong, that some cosmic balance needed restoring, without ever requiring a god to answer for it. Medusa's story fits this mold almost perfectly. But it's also, arguably, the version that is aged into the sharpest, most legible critique of the pattern itself, because Ovid, more than almost any other ancient poet working with this kind of material, seems to want his reader to notice the injustice rather than simply accept it as the unremarkable cost of divine business as usual. He lingers on it. He makes Athena's anger feel petty rather than righteous. He gives the reader just enough space to feel, alongside Medusa, that something deeply wrong has happened here, and that no metamorphosis into monstrosity could ever make it fair. It's part of why, out of dozens of similarly shaped myths from the same tradition, hers is the one that has traveled furthest into the modern world, and the one so many contemporary readers reach for first when they want a single ancient image for an old and still familiar injustice. Chapter 33. The Grey Shore. One last time we opened this story on an island at the edge of the old maps, and it seemed right to close there too. Picture it again, now that you know the whole of it. The ash-colored shoreline. the wind that never quite stops moving, the mouth of the cave where the sound of the sea talked to itself, the way it does when it thinks no one is listening. Only now you know what that silence actually held. Not a monster waiting to strike. A woman who had once tended a sacred flame at dawn, in a temple she loved, in service of a goddess she trusted completely. A woman who was harmed in the one place that should have kept her safe, and then told by the very authority meant to protect her that the harm was somehow her own fault to carry. A woman who never hunted anyone, who simply existed on a shore nobody was supposed to find, while the rest of the world kept sending its bravest and most ambitious sons to test themselves against her, one after another, for years. A woman who, even in the last moment of her life, gave the world two entirely new legends, one that soared and one that stayed behind to build kingdoms. A woman whose blood carried both the deadliest poison the ancient world knew and the only cure for death itself. A woman whose face, torn from her by a curse she never deserved, went on to guard temple doorways and household thresholds across 3,000 years of human history, protecting exactly the kind of ordinary people who had once been taught to fear her. It is, when you lay it out plainly like this, one of the oldest stories human beings have ever told each other. Older than Rome. Older than most of what we now call Western literature. And yet it has never quite stopped being current, because the shape of it, harm, blame, exile, and then, slowly, a kind of reclamation, is a shape we are still, all these centuries later, trying to learn how to break. The old poets gave her snakes for hair, and a gaze that turned men to stone, and called it a monster's curse. Maybe it always was something else, wearing that costume the whole time. A woman who simply would not stop being looked at, on the one hand, seen for what had actually happened to her. On the other, no matter how many centuries, how many poets, how many careless retellings tried to convince the world to look away. Thanks for listening all the way to the gray shore. And, at last, all the way back. And so, Medusa's story fades once more into the world of legend. Thank you for spending this peaceful evening with me here on Mythborn. I hope this ancient tale helped you slow down, unwind, and leave the noise of the day behind. If you enjoyed our journey together, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to Mythborn, and share your favorite myth or the legend you'd like to hear next. Now, stay warm, rest well, and let the old stories carry you gently into peaceful dreams. Until next time, good night.